the promoter said, well, we need your insurance, so you need to be checked up for something. They found that I had a prostate prostate cancer.
Word is now out that Britain's most enduring pop icon, Sir Cliff Richard, faced a cancer diagnosis that could have changed everything, and fans across the world are genuinely worried about what this means for the future of his legendary career. Now people everywhere are forced to ask the real question: is the curtain finally closing on the man who refused to stop? Well, stay right here until the very end, because by the close of this video, the full story will be laid out for you. Ready? Let's find out together. The BBC raid and the nightmare that shook his world. Now that the foundation has been laid, this is where the story takes a turn that no one in the entertainment world was prepared for. Because what happened to Cliff Richard in August 2014 was not just a personal crisis. It was one of the most controversial and legally significant events in British media history, and its effects rippled far beyond the man at the center of it. In June 2014, South Yorkshire Police became aware of an allegation that in 1986, Cliff Richard had sexually assaulted a boy under the age of 16 at a show by the renowned American evangelist Billy Graham. The investigation was conducted under Operation U-Tree, the wide-ranging inquiry into historical sex abuse that had emerged from the Jimmy Savile scandal. At this stage, Cliff Richard himself had no idea he was being investigated. The whole matter was confidential, as any police investigation involving an uncharged individual would normally be expected to remain. What happened next tore that expectation apart. A BBC reporter named Daniel Johnson discovered the existence of the investigation through an unknown source connected to the operation. Rather than treating that information as confidential and approaching it with caution, the BBC went directly to South Yorkshire Police and pressed for more details. The police, concerned about the possibility that the BBC might publish the story before officers were ready to conduct a search of Richard's property in Berkshire, made a fateful decision to cooperate. They told the BBC when the search would take place, giving the broadcaster less than 24 hours' notice. What came next was, by the judge's own later assessment, a serious and sensationalist invasion of privacy. On the 14th of August, 2014, the BBC deployed a helicopter to film the police raid from the air, sent journalists to Richard's property in Berkshire, and simultaneously dispatched reporters to his homes in Portugal and Barbados. The coverage of the search was broadcast across 44 BBC television outputs on that first day alone, with a further 15 broadcasts the following day. Richard, who was in Portugal at the time, found out about the criminal allegation only just before the broadcast began, and did not learn it had been made public until friends began contacting him to say they had seen it on the news. He did not know whether to go home or stay abroad, and was subsequently doorstepped by journalists for weeks. No charges were ever brought. In June 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service informed Cliff Richard that the investigation had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. He had spent 2 full years living under the shadow of allegations that had been splashed across the nation by one of the most trusted broadcasters in the world. He did not stay silent. Cliff Richard sued both South Yorkshire Police and the BBC for breach of privacy. South Yorkshire Police admitted liability before the case reached trial, apologized formally, and agreed to pay damages of £400,000 plus £300,000 in legal costs. The BBC chose to fight the case in the High Court, arguing that its right to freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights outweighed any privacy expectation Richard might have had as a suspect. Mr. Justice Mann rejected that argument entirely. The court found that Cliff Richard held a reasonable expectation of privacy in relation to the police investigation, and that the BBC had infringed that right in a serious and sensationalist manner. The judge noted that the BBC BBC had been more impressed by the size of the story and the chance to beat rival outlets than by any genuine public interest in naming the individual involved. The court held that while the public has a legitimate interest in knowing that police investigate historical sex abuse cases, that interest does not extend to identifying the person under investigation before any charge has been brought. The BBC was ordered to pay £190,000 in general damages and a further £20,000 in aggravated damages, with special damages relating to financial losses to be assessed separately. The judgment set a precedent that fundamentally changed the way British media could report on police investigations, and it gave Cliff Richard a legal vindication that no one could take away from him. But legal victories rarely heal wounds that run as deep as the ones those 2 years left behind. He had described the experience as having a serious emotional and physical toll on him, and anyone who has followed his public statements in the years since would know that the memory of that period never fully left him. The fact that he fought back, won, and refused to let it define the rest of his story says everything about who Cliff Richard really is. The man behind the legend. Who is Cliff Richard? Before anything else can be understood about the storm that has surrounded Cliff Richard in recent years, the story has to start at the beginning, because the weight of what he has faced only becomes truly clear when you understand just how much he built over the course of more than 6 decades. Sir Harry Roger Webb was born on the 14th of October 1940 at King George's Hospital in Lucknow, which was then part of British India. His father, Roger Oscar Webb, worked as a manager for a catering contractor that served the Indian Railways, and the family lived in an area called Maqbara during those early years. Life was comfortable enough in India, but everything changed after Indian independence in 1948, when the Webb family packed their lives onto the SS Ranchi and sailed to Tilbury in Essex, beginning a completely new chapter on British soil. Young Harry grew up in North London, where he fell deeply in love with music during the skiffle craze that was sweeping Britain in the mid-1950s. He formed a school group called the Quintones in 1957, then sang with the Dick Teague Skiffle Group. And it was during those years of early rehearsals and late-night practice sessions that something started to shift. The boy who had arrived from India with nothing more than ambition began transforming into something the country had never quite seen before. The name change came early in 1958. Entrepreneur Harry Greatorex suggested the first name Cliff as a play on the word rock, as in a cliff face, suggesting a rough and jagged sound. Then musician Ian Samwell, who would later write some of Richard's most important songs, added the surname Richard as a tribute to the American rock and roll pioneer Little Richard. And just like that, a new identity was born. Cliff Richard and his backing group, initially known as the Drifters and later renamed the Shadows, arrived on the British music scene with the force of something no one had been prepared for. In August 1958, Cliff Richard was signed to EMI's Columbia label, and his debut single was released before the summer ended. The song that Samwell wrote for the B-side of that debut, reportedly composed while riding a Green Line bus on the way to a rehearsal, became far more important than anyone had anticipated. That song was Move It, and it reached number 2 on the UK singles chart, quickly earning a reputation that has never been challenged. It is widely considered Britain's first authentic rock and roll record. John Lennon himself reportedly said that before Cliff and the Shadows, there had been nothing worth listening to in British music. That is not a small statement to have made about anyone. The years that followed were nothing short of extraordinary. Cliff Richard became the teen idol that an entire generation of British young people had been waiting for. Where previously they had looked to America for their rock heroes, suddenly there was someone homegrown delivering that same electricity from stages across the country. Girls screamed, boys took notice, and the press scrambled to give this new phenomenon a label. They called him the British Elvis. And while that comparison carried enormous weight at the time, history would prove that Cliff Richard was building something far more lasting than any imitation could ever achieve. The hits came fast and in succession. Living Doll became his first #1 single in 1959, followed immediately by Travelin' Light. He was named the #1 cinema box office attraction in Britain for both 1962 and 1963, beating even James Bond at the peak of that franchise's popularity. Films including The Young Ones, Summer Holiday, and Wonderful Life turned him into a full entertainment force rather than simply a recording artist. And the title song from The Young Ones became his biggest-selling UK single at the time, selling over 1 million copies in the country alone. Then came the Beatles, and everything changed for every British artist who had dominated the charts before 1963. Cliff Richard was no exception. The Mersey sound swept through British music and reshaped the landscape entirely. He continued to record, continued to tour, and continued to place records in the charts. But the monopoly on the British music scene that he and the Shadows had enjoyed for 5 years was gone. What happened next, however, said more about his character than any hit record ever could. In 1964, Cliff Richard made a very public declaration that he had become an active evangelical Christian. For a hip-shaking pop star at the height of his fame, that announcement carried real risk. He considered abandoning music entirely, even looking into the possibility of becoming a teacher. But close friends within his faith community advised him that a life in music and a Christian identity were not mutually exclusive, and that persuasion kept one of Britain's greatest careers alive. He continued recording secular songs while also devoting significant time to Christian causes, including appearances alongside the evangelist Billy Graham. He even starred in the 1967 Billy Graham film Two a Penny. Far from weakening his career, this dual path only deepened the loyalty of his fan base. The 1970s and 1980s brought new heights. His 1979 single We Don't Talk Anymore became his first major American chart success, reaching the top 10 in the United States and selling close to 3 million copies worldwide. Devil Woman had already given him a top 5 hit in the US in 1976, and together these songs introduced him to audiences who had little awareness of what had been happening across the Atlantic throughout the 1960s. Back in Britain, he hosted long-running variety television shows on the BBC, one of which helped launch the career of a young Australian singer named Olivia Newton-John. The man had a gift not only for enduring, but for elevating everything around him. By the late 1990s, Cliff Richard had sold more than 250 million records worldwide, placing him among the best-selling music artists of all time. In 1995, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him for his contributions to music, making him Sir Cliff Richard. He holds the extraordinary distinction of being the only artist ever to achieve a top 5 album in 8 consecutive decades in the United Kingdom, a record recognized by the official charts company and one that no other performer in the history of British music has come close to matching. As of 2026, he stands as the 3rd top-selling artist in UK singles chart history, behind only the Beatles and Elvis Presley, when a brilliant career came face-to-face with cancer. Just when it seemed that the worst was behind him, and the remarkable story of Cliff Richard's life was heading into a triumphant final chapter, a completely unexpected development brought everything to a halt in a way that no legal battle ever could. In early 2024, Cliff Richard was preparing for something significant. He had not performed in Australia and New Zealand since 2013, a gap of 11 years, and a major tour was being organized to bring him back to those audiences. Before any international tour of that scale, insurance companies require the artists to undergo a thorough health checkup, and Richard's promoter made clear that this was a necessary step before anything could move forward. He was 83 years old at the time, feeling healthy, active, and in good spirits. There were no symptoms, no family history of concern, and no particular reason for alarm. The medical check revealed something that nobody in his circle had been expecting. Sir Cliff Richard was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer in 2024. discovered entirely by chance during a routine pre-tour insurance medical. The cancer, he later shared publicly, had not metastasized. It had not moved into his bones or any surrounding tissue. By every medical measure available, it had been caught at the earliest possible moment. But early detection is not the same as no threat, and the following 12 months brought something that Britain's biggest pop star had never had to navigate before: a private health battle that he faced while the world remained completely unaware. He underwent a year-long course of targeted therapy. The specifics of his treatment remained private at his preference, which was a decision that anyone who has lived through a serious illness would understand immediately. He kept performing, kept planning, kept moving forward with the tour of Australia and New Zealand that had originally prompted the discovery. The Can't Stop Me Now tour went ahead as scheduled, bringing him back to audiences across the Pacific for the first time in over a decade, before heading to the United Kingdom for a series of 6 dates in late 2025, culminating in 2 nights at the Royal Albert Hall in London on December 8th and 9th. To the tens of thousands of fans who attended those shows, there was nothing to suggest the man on stage had spent the preceding year quietly managing cancer treatment. Reviews described his performances as filled with energy, charisma, and the kind of stage presence that had defined him for more than 60 years. Audiences sang along to Move It, We Don't Talk Anymore, Devil Woman, and Ocean Deep, and the atmosphere at each venue was precisely what anyone who had followed this career would have expected. Whatever he had been through privately, the stage had not lost him. Then, on the 15th of December 2025, everything that had been held privately became public. Sir Cliff Richard appeared on ITV's Good Morning Britain and revealed his cancer diagnosis for the first time, speaking in a deeply personal conversation with veteran broadcaster Dermot Murnaghan, who himself was living with stage 4 advanced prostate cancer at the time. The timing of the disclosure was clearly deliberate. Rather than announcing the news and letting it become simply a personal story, Richard used the platform to deliver a message that went far beyond his own situation. He was direct, unambiguous, and deeply personal in the way he described what he had been through. The cancer, he explained, was caught while it was still young and had not yet spread. He was grateful for the timing of the discovery, but he was also honest about the uncertainty that remained. He acknowledged plainly that whether the cancer would return was something no one could predict with certainty, and that he would continue his quarterly monitoring to stay ahead of any recurrence. He was not asking for sympathy. He was asking for action. The full weight of that conversation and what it meant not just for him, but for countless other men across the country is what the next part of this story is really about. The fight he chose to pick with the entire system. Now, here is where things shift from personal struggle to something much bigger, because Cliff Richard did not walk onto that Good Morning Britain set simply to share his medical history. He walked on with a mission, and what he said next put him in direct confrontation with official policy in a way that made headlines across the country. The core of the issue is this: prostate cancer is the most common cancer diagnosed in British men, with around 63,000 new cases recorded every year in the United Kingdom. According to Prostate Cancer UK, approximately 12,000 men die from the disease annually. Yet unlike breast cancer, cervical cancer, or bowel cancer, prostate cancer has no national screening program in Britain. Men over 50 are not routinely invited for a PSA blood test, which measures levels of prostate-specific antigen and can indicate the possible presence of the disease. They only get checked if they ask, and many never ask at all. The UK National Screening Committee released a draft recommendation in November 2025 suggesting that a screening program for all men was likely to cause more harm than good, arguing that some prostate cancers grow so slowly that they would never become life-threatening within a normal lifespan, and that overtreatment carried its own serious risks, including damage to bladder control and sexual function. Instead, the committee proposed a targeted biennial screening program only for men aged 45 to 61 who carry specific genetic mutations such as BRCA BRCA1 or BRCA2. Cliff Richard called the entire situation completely absurd. He described the current absence of a national screening program as absolutely ridiculous and made the case with the kind of clarity that only a personal experience of the disease can produce. He pointed out that his cancer had been found entirely by chance, through an insurance requirement rather than any health-driven initiative. Had he not needed that insurance check for the tour, the cancer would have been undetected at that stage, and everything that followed might have looked very different. He pressed the point that ordinary men without the resources or circumstances of a touring entertainer would not have had that same fortunate accident of discovery. The argument he made was direct. If the cancer is caught before it spreads, the outcomes are overwhelmingly positive. If it is caught late, the picture becomes far more complicated and often far more devastating. He was not speaking theoretically. He had lived through the early detection side of that equation and was grateful for it every day. And he was furious that the system was not set up to give other men the same chance. He went further than simply appealing to the government in the abstract. Sir Cliff Richard called on King Charles III directly, pointing out that the monarch had himself gone through cancer treatment and that the king's own experience of diagnosis and recovery placed him in a unique position to front a national awareness campaign. While Buckingham Palace had confirmed that the king's cancer was not prostate cancer, Richard argued that the importance of early detection applied across the spectrum and that the king's willingness to speak about his own experience had already made an enormous impact on public awareness. Richard said that he himself would gladly join any campaign the king chose to lead on men's cancer screening. The response from the medical and campaigning world was significant. Prostate cancer. UK welcomed his intervention, and the public debate around the National Screening Committee's draft recommendations intensified in the weeks that followed. High-profile figures including Olympic cycling champion Sir Chris Hoy and former Prime Minister Lord David Cameron had already been raising their voices on the same issue, but the addition of Cliff Richard's personal testimony brought the conversation to an even wider audience. He also made a point that went beyond policy and into culture. He argued that men as a group are conditioned to downplay their health concerns, to feel embarrassed about discussing symptoms, and to avoid medical appointments as a point of pride or indifference. He named that pattern directly and called for it to end. His message, delivered with the full weight of his personal experience and his public standing, was clear. No one is immune, symptoms are not always present, and waiting until something feels wrong may already be too late. What comes next for Cliff Richard in 2026 and beyond? After everything covered in this video, a reasonable person might expect the story to end somewhere close to a quiet retreat from public life. It does not, because if the evidence of the past 68 years has shown anything at all, it is that Cliff Richard does not retreat. At the point of his cancer disclosure in December 2025, he was already planning actively for the year ahead. The OncoDaily.com profile, published in December 2025, noted that he was making plans for 2026 tours and maintaining a routine of daily exercise. For a man of 85 who had just completed a year of cancer treatment and a full touring schedule spanning 2 continents, that level of forward momentum is genuinely remarkable. His PSA tests continue quarterly. His imaging follows the monitoring schedule his doctors have set, and he has described his current health status as cancer-free while remaining appropriately cautious about the long-term picture. His most recent album, Music, The Air That I Breathe, was released in 2020, and while he has not confirmed a new studio record for the immediate future, the creative energy has clearly not left him. The Can't Stop Me Now tour in 2025 was declared a great success on his official website, and the 2 Royal Albert Hall dates that closed the UK leg were received with enormous enthusiasm by audiences who had traveled from across Britain and beyond to attend. One reviewer on Ticketmaster noted that fans had even come from Bulgaria to be there, which says everything about the global depth of loyalty he commands. His official records continue to stand unchallenged. He remains the only artist in history to achieve a top 5 album across 8 consecutive decades in the United Kingdom, a fact confirmed by the official charts company, and one that places him entirely in a category of his own when the full sweep of British popular music is considered. 14 #1 singles, 7 #1 albums, 96 top 20 hits, and total worldwide record sales of over 250 million are not numbers that become less significant simply because time passes. If anything, the passage of time has made them more extraordinary. Beyond the music itself, his advocacy work has given this chapter of his life a purpose that extends far beyond entertainment. The Cliff Richard Charitable Trust has operated for many years, supporting causes that range from schools to hospitals to special needs facilities. He established the Cliff Richard Tennis Foundation in 1991, which has brought tennis to over 200,000 children across UK primary schools and has since been incorporated into the charitable wing of the Lawn Tennis Association. The man who spent decades at the top of the charts has consistently used that position to do something beyond simply holding it. The prostate cancer advocacy dimension is the newest addition to that pattern, and it is perhaps the most urgent. By speaking publicly at the age of 85 about a health battle he could easily have kept entirely private, Cliff Richard made a choice that carried real weight. He knew the conversation would attract attention not just to him, but to the broader issue of men's health in Britain. He knew that his name still commands a level of recognition that very few public figures can match, and he deployed that recognition in a direction that could genuinely change policy outcomes and save lives. The question of what the long-term future looks like for his performing career is one that only he can answer. And based on everything he has said publicly, even he does not appear to have made a final decision. He once told the press, in a comment reported through the Daily Express via Woman's Weekly, that he had no intention of making a series of comebacks, and that he found the cycle of retirement and return that other artists had gone through to be something he wanted to avoid entirely. His position seemed to be that when the time came to stop, he would stop decisively, and that he was not at that point yet. Whether 2026 brings new live dates, a new recording project, or a continuing focus on health advocacy, the story of Cliff Richard has clearly not reached its final chapter. His net worth in 2026 is estimated at approximately $120 million, built across decades of touring, record sales, royalties, and the kind of sustained commercial relevance that very few artists sustain for even a quarter of the time he has maintained it. There are not many lives that can hold together the arc of this one. The boy from India who became Britain's first rock and roll star. The pop icon who survived the Beatles and 4 more generations of musical revolution. The man who fought the BBC in the High Court and won. The cancer survivor who turned his private battle into a national campaign. And the 85-year-old performer who concluded a 2-continent tour at the Royal Albert Hall in December 2025 to a full house of people who had been waiting decades to see him one more time. Things are not looking good for Cliff Richard in the way that the title of this video might suggest at first hearing. The truth, as it turns out, is considerably more complicated than that. The challenges have been real, the battles have been serious, and the health scare that emerged in 2025 was genuine and significant. But Cliff Richard has faced every one of those storms with the same posture he brought to the stage in 1958, facing forward, refusing to stop, and doing it all with a career that continues to defy every expectation the world ever placed on it. The curtain has not fallen yet, and if his entire story is anything to go by, it will not fall quietly when it finally does. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.